I used to believe that life only changed in loud, dramatic moments, the kind that announce themselves with slammed doors or raised voices. I was wrong. Mine began quietly, on an ordinary evening, when I realized I was more interested in escaping my own thoughts than sharing them with the person sitting across from me. We had been together long enough to predict each other's sentences. Comfort had replaced curiosity. Love, if it was still there, had learned how to whisper instead of speak. I remember watching the condensation slide down my glass while they talked about their day, nodding at the right moments, feeling strangely detached, like I was observing my own life from a few steps outside it. I didn't wake up wanting to betray anyone. I woke up wanting to feel. That distinction mattered to me then, even if it sounds like a lie now. The first crack appeared when I decided to try something new, something small, something I could justify. An online creative space. A place where strangers shared thoughts without history or expectation. It felt harmless, almost responsible. I told myself I needed an outlet, not an escape. That's where I met the other voice in this story. They noticed me in a way I hadn't been noticed in years, not my routines, not my reliability, but my words. They asked questions that didn't feel invasive, only attentive. Our exchanges were thoughtful, measured, and dangerously easy. There was no flirting at first, no intention. Just the subtle relief of being understood without having to explain myself. At home, the distance grew sharper by contrast. Silence became heavier. Conversations stayed practical, efficient, emotionally safe. I started to realize that the conflict wasn't between two people, it was within me. Between who I was and who I had stopped becoming. I knew, even then, that something fragile was forming. Not love, not yet, but a connection that demanded honesty I hadn't offered my own relationship in a long time. Each message pulled me further into a version of myself that felt awake, curious, and guilty all at once. The central conflict wasn't about infidelity, not yet. It was about choice. About whether emotional absence was as damaging as betrayal. About whether staying quiet was kinder than telling the truth. That night, as I lay beside someone who knew my habits but not my thoughts, I understood something unsettling. Trying something new hadn't changed my circumstances, it had exposed them. And once seen, they could no longer be ignored. I closed my eyes, aware that whatever came next would demand a reckoning I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but one I could no longer avoid. The days that followed settled into a careful imbalance. Nothing outward changed, yet everything felt precarious, as if one wrong step would expose what I was trying so hard to keep contained. At home, familiarity pressed in from all sides. We moved around each other with practiced ease, shared meals, shared space, shared history, while avoiding the growing absence that neither of us wanted to name. I studied my partner in quiet moments, searching for signs I had missed before. The way they spoke with certainty about plans that no longer felt mutual. The way affection had become habitual rather than intentional. It wasn't that we were unhappy together, it was that we were no longer curious about each other. That realization carried a strange grief, heavy and persistent. The connection I'd begun elsewhere grew with unnerving speed. Messages arrived at unexpected hours, thoughtful and restrained, never demanding yet always welcome. The person on the other side never asked for more than I offered, which somehow made everything feel more dangerous. I found myself editing my honesty, what I revealed, what I withheld, not out of deception at first, but out of fear. Fear of what it would mean if this bond mattered as much as it already did. My internal conflict sharpened. I told myself that emotional loyalty was a flexible concept, that silence wasn't the same as lying. Still, guilt surfaced in quiet moments, while brushing my teeth, while listening to my partner breathe beside me in the dark. I began to understand how easily people drift, not through intention, but through neglect. One evening, my partner asked if something was wrong. The question was gentle, almost rehearsed, as though they had sensed the distance but didn't know how to approach it. I considered honesty then. I felt it rise in my chest, urgent and terrifying. But I deflected, offering a safe answer about stress and fatigue. They accepted it with a nod, relief and disappointment tangled together. That small lie changed the tone of everything. After that, I guarded my phone more carefully. Not because I feared being discovered, but because discovery would force decisions I wasn't ready to make. The connection outside my relationship had become a mirror, reflecting needs I'd ignored for too long. It showed me how much I'd learned to endure instead of address. The central conflict crystallized: remain silent and preserve the shape of my life, or speak and risk unraveling it. Neither option felt clean. Both demanded loss. As the days passed, the space between intention and consequence narrowed. I could sense an approaching moment, one that would require action rather than reflection. The comfort of indecision was slipping away, replaced by an uncomfortable clarity. I ended the night staring at the ceiling, aware that maintaining balance required more effort than surrendering to change. And somewhere between fear and longing, I realized the story had already moved beyond its beginning, carrying me toward an outcome I could no longer pretend wasn't coming. The shift from restraint to anticipation happened almost imperceptibly. What had once been occasional messages became a quiet constant, woven into the spaces between my daily obligations. I told myself I was still in control, that awareness alone was enough to keep the line intact. Yet each conversation made that line harder to see. We spoke with a careful intimacy, circling truths without naming them. They asked about my days, my thoughts, the parts of me that felt unfinished. I answered more honestly than I ever had at home, and that disparity unsettled me. It wasn't the connection itself that frightened me, it was how naturally I leaned into it. At home, tension manifested in subtle ways. Pauses stretched longer. Responses arrived a second too late. My partner noticed, even if they didn't yet understand. When they reached for me, I felt the weight of comparison, an instinctive calculation I resented myself for making. I had invited another presence into my inner life, and now it stood between us. The possibility of meeting arose without ceremony. No proposal, no pressure, just a passing remark about proximity and timing. I read it several times, heart accelerating with each repetition. The suggestion carried no explicit intent, yet it changed the stakes instantly. Abstract connection threatened to become tangible, and I was forced to confront what I was willing to risk. I delayed my response, using the pause to interrogate myself. I rehearsed refusals and justifications alike. I told myself meeting wouldn't change anything, that clarity required context, that uncertainty was the greater danger. Even as I constructed these arguments, I recognized them for what they were: permission disguised as reason. When I finally agreed, the decision felt both deliberate and inevitable. A calm settled over me, followed closely by dread. I hadn't crossed a boundary yet, but I was standing close enough to feel its heat. Every message afterward carried new gravity, each word a quiet step forward. My partner sensed the withdrawal. One evening, they asked if I still wanted the life we were building. The question landed harder than any accusation. I wanted to say yes without hesitation, but honesty stalled me. Instead, I answered with uncertainty, and watched hurt register before they masked it with composure. That moment lingered. It clarified what I was risking: not just trust, but the shared future we'd assumed was secure. The realization didn't stop me, but it sharpened the cost. As the day of the meeting approached, I understood that I was no longer choosing between two people. I was choosing between remaining within the safety of what was known and stepping into a truth I had avoided naming. Whatever waited on the other side of that choice, I sensed it would demand more than explanation. The story, I knew then, was approaching its turning point. And once reached, there would be no way to return unchanged. Meeting them did not arrive with drama or spectacle. It unfolded quietly, almost cautiously, as if we were both aware that something fragile stood between us. We spoke as we always had, measured, attentive, but the physical presence altered the weight of every pause. Silence no longer felt neutral. It felt charged, deliberate. I noticed details I hadn't imagined before: the way they listened without interrupting, the ease with which their expressions mirrored understanding rather than judgment. It wasn't intoxicating in the way I'd feared. It was grounding. And that frightened me more than longing ever could. There was no touch beyond a brief greeting. No explicit declaration. Yet I felt unmistakably exposed. Being seen so clearly made avoidance impossible. This wasn't an escape from my life, It was a confrontation with what I had been denying. At some point, they asked a simple question: whether I was happy. Not whether I loved my partner. Not whether I intended to leave. Just happiness. I opened my mouth to answer and felt the truth stall, heavy and uncooperative. I couldn't lie without hearing the lie myself. I don't know, I finally said. The admission echoed louder than I expected. In that moment, I realized how much effort I'd spent maintaining uncertainty as a form of protection. Naming doubt gave it shape, meaning, consequence. We parted without promises, without plans. But the separation didn't restore distance, it clarified everything. On the way home, the familiar streets felt altered, as though I were seeing them after a long absence. I wasn't returning unchanged. I carried a clarity I hadn't asked for but could no longer refuse. That evening, my partner noticed immediately. Not the meeting, but the shift. I moved with a resolve that hadn't been there before. When they asked what was wrong, I didn't deflect. I didn't soften. I told them I was struggling not with temptation, but with truth. The conversation stretched late into the night. I spoke about distance, about silence, about the ways we'd both chosen comfort over honesty. I didn't name the other person at first, but the outline was clear enough. My partner listened, face unreadable, until understanding settled into something like grief. When the truth finally surfaced, carefully, fully, it landed between us like a fracture. There were no raised voices. Just stillness. The kind that follows impact. They asked when it started. I couldn't give a clean answer. That, too, felt like a betrayal. What surprised me most wasn't their anger, but their recognition. They admitted they had felt me slipping away long before I noticed it myself. That acknowledgement didn't absolve me, but it complicated the blame. We were both staring at the consequences of things left unsaid. By the end of the night, nothing was resolved. But everything had been exposed. The life we'd assumed was stable now stood revealed as conditional, dependent on work we had postponed for too long. As I lay awake afterward, I understood the turning point had passed. The story was no longer about secrecy or restraint. It was about aftermath. And whatever came next would be shaped not by what I wanted, but by what I was finally willing to face. The days that followed moved slowly, as though time itself needed space to absorb what had been said. Nothing was settled, yet nothing was hidden anymore. My partner and I existed in a fragile truce of honesty, speaking carefully, listening more than we had in years, both aware that clarity did not guarantee repair. We revisited memories we had once treated as foundations, examining where they had cracked. Some conversations brought tenderness back into the room. Others reopened wounds neither of us knew how to tend. There was no single moment of forgiveness or rejection, only a series of small reckonings that demanded patience and humility. I thought often about the person who had disrupted the stillness of my life without ever intending to. Their role was no longer active, yet their presence lingered not as temptation, but as a reminder. They had reflected something back to me I could not unsee, the cost of emotional absence, and the danger of mistaking silence for stability. What surprised me most was how little certainty I felt about the future. I had expected revelation to bring direction, some clear path forward. Instead, it brought responsibility. I was no longer reacting to dissatisfaction, I was accountable for what came next. My partner asked, quietly, whether I believed we could rebuild something real rather than familiar. The question wasn't a plea. It was an invitation. I didn't answer immediately, because I finally understood the weight of words spoken too quickly. Hope without action had been our shared mistake. I want to try, I said, not as a promise, but as a commitment to effort rather than avoidance. That answer didn't close the story. It opened it differently. I learned that change doesn't always arrive to rescue us. Sometimes it arrives to expose us. Trying something new didn't solve my life, but it dismantled the illusions I had been hiding behind. It forced me to confront how easily connection can be misplaced when honesty is deferred. There are still moments of doubt. Still consequences that haven't fully unfolded. But there is also something else now, awareness. And with it, the possibility of choice made consciously rather than quietly. The life I'm living isn't simpler than before. It's more deliberate. And perhaps that is the real transformation, not the disruption itself, but the willingness to face what follows it. Even when the ending remains unwritten, life did not return to normal after that. It redefined what normal meant. Every interaction carried an awareness that hadn't existed before, as though we were both learning how to inhabit the same space again without assumptions to shield us. My partner and I spoke differently now. Less defensively. More deliberately. Silence still appeared, but it no longer felt empty, it felt cautious, purposeful. We were learning where honesty ended and vulnerability began, and how easily one could turn into a weapon if mishandled. Trust, I learned, does not return all at once. It arrives in fragments, earned through consistency rather than declarations. At times, I questioned whether staying was an act of courage or fear. Leaving would have been simpler in some ways, cleaner, easier to narrate. Staying required endurance. It required confronting the version of myself capable of quiet betrayal and choosing, repeatedly, not to retreat into comfort. The other connection faded into the background, not erased but contextualized. It became part of the story rather than its destination. I no longer wondered what might have been. That curiosity had cost enough. What mattered now was what could still be built, if both of us were willing to accept the discomfort of rebuilding. One evening, my partner admitted they felt seen again for the first time in years. The confession startled me. It meant that effort was reaching beyond intention, that something fragile was taking shape. I felt a cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge that progress was reversible. Nothing about this was guaranteed. I began to understand that infidelity is rarely about desire alone. It is often about avoidance of conversations, of accountability, of admitting that something once strong has weakened. I had avoided truth until it found me anyway, dressed as change. The central conflict hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. The question was no longer whether I would cross a line, but whether I could live with clarity instead of escape. Whether growth could outpace regret. There are days when doubt resurfaces, uninvited and persistent. But there are also moments, quiet, ordinary ones, when presence feels like enough. When staying feels intentional rather than habitual. This story does not end with certainty. It ends with awareness. With the understanding that trying something new did not define me, but what I chose to do after being exposed might. And perhaps that is the most honest ending I can offer, not resolution, but responsibility. A life no longer lived on autopilot, moving forward not because it is easy, but because it is finally being lived with open eyes.